Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. Experiences which help to um, experiences which they have shared, which helps us to understand how it is and what it is that helps them to gain their sense of identity and their sense of belonging. And it's been a privilege to have so many people share those stories with me. And as I say this every week, and I've never been proven wrong, right? I've got a really special guest, and our guest this week is Attar Rahman. And Attar is a communications officer and information technologist at Imperial College London. He's so much more than that. That's just a title. He's much more than that. And he's going to be sharing his story with us this afternoon. So Atta, I want to just say welcome and say thank you for being our guest today. And I'm going to kick off by asking my usual question, which is, can you tell me what it was that whilst you were growing up gave you your sense of identity and your sense of belonging?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for having me as well, Wayne. Very excited to be here. So this is a really broad question, obviously. So I think there's quite a few facets to cover. I think that in terms of my early childhood, so I grew up in as a children of South Asian immigrant parents from Pakistan, and that obviously shaped part of my identity. But within that, there was already layers sort of embedded within that. So my mum hadn't spent much time over there and had spent a lot more of her life here, whereas my dad was the opposite. So I sort
Mhm.
of almost grew up with two cultures even at home. And then, despite growing up in London, which this is a really strange oddity, I actually didn't actually grow up in an area that was particularly full of people of color.
Mhm.
Um, and my primary school, for example, and bear in mind this is in the late 90s, I was one of three kids of color, which was really strange, very rare for the time. And on our road where we live, which I'm currently talking to you from now as well, we didn't have another single family of color move on there until 2003, so when I was 15. And even though obviously I grew up in London and I grew up in a very multicultural city, in my immediate sphere, I was, not. I was the odd one out in that sense,
Mhm.
and I think that shaped me as well because when I went to secondary school and there were far more people, there was a huge numbers of South Asian students. I felt othered by them because I didn't speak like them. I didn't kind of have the same experiences as them. I'd behave differently, and that was, fairly obvious because of my upbringing, because of the ways in which. So I think in terms of kind of I've always grappled in that way with my South Asian identity, particularly in those earlier years, to kind of find my space within it. And then I think exacerbating that was coming out, which happened when I was 19.
Mhm.
And because obviously, as we all know, unfortunately, in South Asian communities, there is entrenched homophobia that still exists today. And I think that made me even further removed from my South Asian identity.
Yeah.
I felt, I was either too white or too gay or too, I just didn't feel like I had a place there. But then conversely, I had the opposite problem in other spheres. So when I came out, so bear in mind this was 2007, 2008. The LGBT community looks a lot different than what it is today in London. It was very white dominated. There were very, very few South Asians, even in terms of the immigrant, even in
Mhm.
terms of sort of the people of color who were part of the community. I think we made up the least.
Yeah.
And there was no visibility. There were no role models as well,
Mhm.
of people of color in the LGBT community at the time. So and in that sense, and I did experience quite a lot of racism in the LGBT community. I'm candid about it, and I think that made me feel like I was too brown for the gays. So I kind of thought, okay, well, I don't really fit in anywhere.
Mhm.
And I think that shaped a lot of my life, if I'm being honest. It's part of the reasons why I've had mental health struggles
Mhm.
in my life. It's part of the reasons why, I probably became very introspective and perhaps almost took on too much myself in terms of, I don't know, forming bad habits such as, and I'm not judging anyone else who does this because I still do, but, maybe my own insecurities and then sort of projecting other people's thoughts onto me, thinking, oh, they must be thinking I'm like this, or and those sorts of things. And I think that's something that I think has carried with me. And it's only really, if I'm being honest, in the last 4 or 5 years that I've managed to kind of figure out where I stand. And this comes from a few changes that I've made in my life. One of which I'm pleased to say is probably one of the best changes I've ever made in my life is I just stopped caring about what everyone thinks of me, which I have to say is one of the most freeing experience as a person, a human being can possibly have. And to anyone who's listening on this call, I really hope this happens to you if it hasn't happened already, because it's honestly so liberating. And that part of that was basically allowing me to realize that actually it doesn't matter if I'm too much for this group or too much for that person. I have my own, I am who I am. I am my own person and I can have my own box. And actually, yeah, so that was a big thing. And then within that, there were lots of things that were embedded with it. So I grew up being raised Muslim, and I'm not practicing now. I don't even identify as one. But when I grew up in my childhood home, being Pakistani and being Muslim meant one and the same.
Yeah.
And as a child, I had no idea what the difference was.
Mhm.
But after taking time out in the last few years as well to research more about Pakistani culture, to visit, to speak to more Pakistani people in the community over there and here, there's a lot more to it than just
Mhm.
the religious aspect. Obviously, there's loads of strands of the culture and elements of which I love and I'm really happy to be part of and very proud of to have heritage from. And I think that's been one of the biggest steps is kind of, really learning to appreciate my Pakistani heritage and finding my place within that, but also being lucky and fortunate enough to meet lots of queer people of color and having lots of queer people of color in my friendship group in London now as well. I've kind of almost sort of, I feel like, reclaimed that side of my identity as well. And instead of always feeling too brown for the gays and too gay for the browns, I'm now just happy and very proud to be both brown and gay. And I think that's a really wonderful place to be in, but it genuinely has taken a really long time, and there's been a long, I'd probably say up until maybe my late 20s, I didn't really feel like I necessarily belonged anywhere. Um, so yeah, sorry, it's a very long answer to your question.
No worries. We're going to unpack some of that. That's a beautiful overview. But what we're going to do is try to unpack some of it because you mentioned about where you grew up, um, kind of like almost by chance, I suppose, being disconnected from your ancestral heritage, as it were, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and the
absolutely.
impact that that had on forming your identity. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, and then not feeling accepted on multiple levels, you know,
yeah, yeah.
and especially during your teenage years when you're trying to find your place in society, find your place, and nobody's saying that where it was it that they weren't accepting you. In what ways was there that pushback
There was quite a lot of bullying,
Mhm,
particularly on the way I spoke. Um, and also just my interests and
mhm,
part of that not that didn't all just come from sort of from just not being sort of brown enough for them. it,
mhm,
it was also obviously people could probably figure out a long time before I actually came out that I was gay, and there were probably strands of that embedded within it as well. But I think yeah, I think what you've said really hit the mark, really, is that I think there were just so many layers of not feeling accepted in so many different spheres that by the time it got to the time where I actually came out, and I'm almost sort of just realizing this on this call now, which is quite funny, is that I think I just almost probably had enough of it all. And that's probably why I sort of maybe went a bit almost into my own shell for a while after that. And probably why I kind of had these kind of realizations around my identity and where I belonged later on. Um, in life, which is, I mean, I'm not saying I'm happy with the journey that I've had. I don't look back on any of it negatively. I think it's all shaped me to be a stronger, better person who I am today. But I think, yeah, I think that definitely what you've said there is a really important point, that I did spend, you know, a lot of my teenage years and my early 20s basically feeling like doors were closing in terms of where I fit. And that obviously did take its toll on me. Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute, Wayne, or I can't hear you anyway.
All right, sorry. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
now it's all good.
There's some noise outside, so I've got a little
No, that's all
semi-mute
right.
button. Right. So just thinking about that then, because especially when you're going through those formative years, and we all want to feel accepted, we all want to feel that people value us, okay? And you did mention about the fact that you kind of like went through a stage where had mental health issues.
Mm.
Uh, Can you kind of like elaborate on that if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about it. So I think my mental health probably got the worst when I came out to my family because they weren't accepting.
Right.
Um, but that wasn't the only thing that was causing it. And it took a long time for me to understand and unpack that actually, there was a theme in my life where I felt like I wasn't fitting in, or I felt like I wasn't good enough in many ways. And a lot of that did come from my family. There was high pressure. I'm sure many people of color have experienced similar things from their parents. High pressure to perform well, to do well at everything, to succeed. But that, I think, I had this habit of putting that on myself and almost
Mm.
creating that kind of sort of high pressure
Issue.
thing for
Yeah.
me. And that obviously that was challenging. And I think then embedded with that, obviously, coming out to my family, them not being accepting, and then not having the easiest experience coming out within the LGBTQ community, as I mentioned before, about kind of experiencing quite a lot of
Mhm.
racism. I mean, I was actually, I'm completely candid about this. I was denied entry to a lot of venues when I first came out that were LGBT because of my skin color.
Mhm.
um yeah, it definitely did take its toll, and and I'm pleased to say that mentally, well, I'm in a much better place now.
Mhm.
I've obviously still going to have mental health struggles throughout my life. We all will, but
Yeah.
I'm doing much better now, and I'm a huge advocate for therapy. It's honestly a lifesaver.
Yeah.
But I think yeah, and I think part of that as well is when I think about when I came out as well, I think I sort of maybe touched on this in the earlier answer. I can't remember now. Um, I didn't have anyone there.
Oh,
There were no LGBTQ
role
people of
models.
color. Yeah, there were
Yeah.
no role models, exactly. And now, obviously, there are, which is fantastic. I hope that I can be for people. In the future, and now even, and I think in some cases I hope I have been already. But there was no one there. There was no one that looked like me,
Yeah.
and no one that I could kind of understand and learn from. And I think that's why, I mean, I'm a huge power and the believer of role models. I think
Yeah.
they can have such influence and they're so important. But I think that would have helped. And yeah, and I hope that, like I said, that I can be that for someone, or that I already have been. But yeah, I think particularly from a mental health standpoint, like I would say, sense of belonging and a sense of identity is so important to good mental health.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, yeah, so I definitely think that a lot of the reasons why, a lot of the changes that I've made in my life, and kind of realizations that I've come to about my belonging and identity have actually helped improve my mental health,
Yeah.
and realizing that actually, you belong where you want to.
Yeah.
You set your own identity. It isn't
Yeah.
set by anybody else.
Yeah. I'm gonna just what you've said is really important, it's really important. And it seems to me that there was a cascade of events, a real cascade of events which happened to you in that coming out to your family not being accepted, going to gay clubs not being accepted, right? Going to community centers or going to where friendship groups not being accepted. So it could be I'm sensing that it was quite lonely for you.
Yeah, yeah, it is an incredibly isolating experience. It's and you know that's not to say that I didn't love my family, that I didn't have good
Mhm.
relationships with them, that I didn't have friends, that I didn't have good relationships with them too. But that's not the same as actually feeling like you belong somewhere,
Yeah,
or feeling like you're in a safe space.
yeah,
And I think that's what was really lacking. And I think that can be lacking for so many people of color, particularly queer people of color, even today. I think that, there's still so much work to be done to create safe spaces for those groups. And I'm very, very lucky that I have one now because even now, while, the world is better than it was 15 years ago, well, in this sense,
yeah,
um, and and that there are and that I've got this amazing group. I think I still treasure so much the queer POC friends that I have
mm,
because they are a community unlike no other. They'll understand me on a level that other people won't, and I think that's really important. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was incredibly isolating, and I think like I said, it can be for so many people. I think it's very easy, to even look at someone in your life who might seem particularly fine, but actually they can be very isolated, which is why these communities, these safe spaces are so important, but also for people to, to see role models, to have people to reach out to, all of these
yeah,
things are still so vital and
yeah.
will always be, I think.
So there's a couple of things which I'm going to try and explore with you, right? Because clearly academically you are still very good, right? But I
Well,
sense that
not
you
not imperial good, but yeah.
listen, you're very good, right? Right. But you had all of these extenuating or other factors which were, I'm going to say, I don't want to say tying you down, but were potentially preventing you from potentially fulfilling your potential. Were you able to disassociate, or did it have that burden feeling as you were going through your education? Or was there, I'm not even quite sure what I'm trying to say if
I
I'm
think I
honest.
think I get you. Yeah, I think elements. I think it's a bit of both. I
Hmm.
think I was able to disassociate enough to do well,
Hmm.
um, but I also think that a lot of this I didn't really understand when I
Hmm.
was that young as well, and even in my 20s, I don't think that I had the language or the education around what it meant to be gay, what it meant to be queer, what it meant to be a person of color
Hmm.
that I think people have the access to now. I'm not saying
Hmm.
all people have the access to it or that it shouldn't be better or more widespread, but and maybe actually in some ways that might have stopped me from maybe realizing just how difficult it was.
Hmm.
But also then it would have made it harder because I didn't really have the ability to kind of explore any of those things. So I think yes, it probably did sort of hinder me
Hmm.
in some ways from being my true self or my
Hmm.
whole self, but it didn't dampen me enough to maybe affect me in education or at work, which I'm
Yeah,
very fortunate to because I know for many people it
yeah,
does.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And did you find safe spaces then? Because I know you said that you've got a safe
mm,
space now, but as you did you ever have pockets of individuals or people? And you did mention about going to therapy as
mm.
well. I'd really like to explore how therapy helped you, but also those pockets of support, that network. Who were your support network as you were going through this? Was it members of the family? Who came in and was holding you up?
My friends have always been a really good support network. I've been really
Mm.
lucky in that sense, but it's only really been in the last few years that I've got this kind of queer POC friendship
Mhm.
group that is a mechanism of support that isn't really available to a lot of people I know now. And I'm very lucky to have that. But before then, I would honestly say that I didn't have this kind of strong peer support network. It was mostly individual friends that I was very close with who I could always confide in, but it wasn't enough a
Mhm.
lot of the time. And that's not saying that they aren't all amazing. They are.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just that I obviously needed more and a more tailored form of kind of support there. But in terms of therapy, what therapy really helped me with were, well, two things. One is it helped me with to actually learn techniques, um, to manage anxiety, to manage depression. I've had bouts flare up of both in my time since I've stopped going to therapy, and I've been able to use those to prevent them from kind of having a huge impact on me. That's not to say that they're always going to work. I know I'll have to live with these two things forever, and I'm
Mhm.
okay with that. But I think that's a key resource that I'll always be able to tap into, which is brilliant. And the second thing is, and I'm going to quote something from a character on a show I love called Schitt's Creek, which I'm sure some of the people on this call have probably seen, where the brother is going for a driving test and he's panicking and fretting about every little thing about what the driving instructor is going to think about what he's wearing, his driving ability, all of this kind of stuff. And it really, that scene stuck with me because I thought, this is what I do all the time. This was my behavior for so many years, just overthinking everything unnecessarily. And the sister just turns around to him and says, no one is thinking about you the way you're thinking about you. And I thought, that's such a good point because no one actually cares. And
Mhm.
most people are just thinking about themselves. Um, so and that honestly is my life mantra now. When I find myself, if I'm going into some sort of spiraling thought, and I've shared this piece of advice with so many people, and it's the truth because most people aren't. So
Mhm.
that therapy helped me to figure that out too. That
Yeah.
I'm not the center of everybody else's world, nor should I be, really, to be honest. So, yeah, but like I said earlier, it has truly been liberating when you basically just kind of realize that your mind is free to suddenly think of all these other things when you're not so stressed about what everybody else is thinking about you.
Yeah.
Because in truth, most of them aren't thinking anything about you at all.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very good point. But we build ourselves these little magnifying glasses which thinks everybody's looking at us under a microscope or under a magnifying glass, and they're scrutinizing every part of our behavior and our being. And there is nobody really doing that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's obviously it's the worst when we're unhappy with ourselves or
Yeah.
unhappy with something,
Yeah.
our own insecurities, and then we project. But yeah, honestly, if I could wish one thing for all the people that I love and for everyone, actually, is just to stop caring about this stuff because it is honestly one of the most liberating experiences a human being I think can have.
Absolutely. I like that mantra. I do like it because I think it would help us not to be, I'm not going to say we're self-obsessed, but sometimes we are. Sometimes we are our universe, as it were.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if we don't, if we fail to recognize that we have to put things into perspective, right? Not everybody's thinking about us. Um, and you know what? It doesn't matter.
yeah,
It really doesn't matter.
yeah.
You know,
In fact, it's actually better. So
yeah,
most of the time, so
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Um, so I remember you doing a really brilliant interview for the Shift in the Lens
yeah.
um experience, and I remember they showed places where you went to and kind of like your environment, and you looked great. You looked like you were at peace with yourself, you
No,
know.
it was a very fun photo shoot. I won't lie.
All right. Um, and part of the story that you've kind of like highlighted so far has been about your shifting of your lens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah. To a point where you can look at yourself and be comfortable in the decisions that you make, in the choices that you make, and basically say, I don't really care what anybody else is thinking, you know? And coming to that realization is something which some people never do come to, and they spend their whole lives in anxiety, etc. So my question, I suppose, is, um, what is it that, not what triggered that, because you've
mm,
already you said, but there's one thing in having that realization, but there's another thing in being able to articulate that and be an active advocate. And to me, you've become that active advocate. Am I right in saying that?
I try to.
Hmm.
Um, I've had a lot of people in my life ask me, you know, when I did Shifting the Lens,
Mhm,
and this wasn't in a negative fashion,
mhm,
but a lot of people have asked, oh, you know, why do you keep telling your story? Because they've
mhm,
noticed I'm very vocal, and
mhm.
you know, and also I'm a bit of an attention whore, so I'll take any opportunity to talk about me and be on any Imperial video or YouTube channel or whatever it is. But but I think, well, the reason is, well, I mean, I've got evidence to support this. You know, so when I did Shifting the Lens and my profile came out, this was in 2022 in the summer,
Mhm.
I had 30 emails that week from people at the university that I didn't know,
Yeah.
um, ranging from, some of them were queer people of color, telling me that their story inspired me to even do something in their own lives, which was incredible. Some of them were people of color who didn't know any queer people, who kind of opened their eyes up to, you know, they saw queer as a white thing, basically. Um, some of them were just people who just thanked me for sharing the story because it taught them something or it moved them or for whatever reason. And the fact is that, you know, I've actually, with some of these people I've actually developed more meaningful relationships with. You know, we've become good friends. We actually meet up, and we've carried those conversations forward, which is lovely. But you know, I think to build those connections, to build understanding, to raise awareness, to open dialogue is why me saying this is really important. And I think that's why campaigns like Shifting the Lens are so important. That's why doing these belonging podcasts are so important, because it doesn't matter if it's only a small number of people sometimes, in your reach, you know, the impact that can then have onwards as well,
Mhm,
is really important. But even so, even if you've just opened up dialogue for one person, you know, my sort of motto is that I'll keep sharing my story, and even if I just make a positive difference in one person's life,
mhm,
it's enough for me, because
mhm,
I didn't get that. And that's not anyone's fault. It's just society wasn't ready to have queer brown people as role models when I came out.
mhm,
Just like for many gay people who grew up 30, 40 years before me, society wasn't ready for queer role models to exist for those people. Um, so I think I just want to do that for somebody. And I'll throw in another little anecdote just because it's
mhm.
such a lovely story. But I was volunteering at Welcome Week in October 2022, and I was just sort of manning an area in Sheffield, helping students find their way. And this student came up to me. He just started an undergrad degree, and he said, "Oh, are you at her?" And I was like, "Oh, yes, hello." I was like, "How does this person know me?" And so I was sort of terrified. Like, have I met you before? What have I done wrong? And he said he'd watched my Shifting the Lens YouTube video, and that was one of the reasons why he applied to Imperial. And I thought, I was honestly moved to tears. I was shocked that, first of all, people, that prospective students had even watched that content. And that, you know, and he was clearly a queer brown person. I mean, I don't want to make assumptions, but I'm presuming that's one of the reasons he resonated with it. And I thought, I've made this person realize that if Imperial allows a staff member who is queer and brown to tell their story on their own terms, which is one of the reasons I love Shifting the Lens, he's obviously recognized that there is a safe space for him
Yeah,
here. And that's an amazing thing to be able to do.
yeah.
And that's why I keep harping on about my life, because I think there's, you know, if I can make anyone feel like that,
Mhm.
then I'm going to keep doing it. And I want all people of color to do the same, because that, you know, you every single person of color has that power with their story for
A-
somebody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's such a beautiful story because one, it demonstrates the inclusivity, right? You sharing your story and not just sharing your story, being given the space and time to share your story without judgment,
Yeah,
you know, is
yeah,
it doesn't happen everywhere. We know
no,
that.
yeah, I certainly do. Yeah,
Right? Yeah,
yeah,
we know that. And if we can then be an example to others and say, you know what, doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what you look like, we will find some way to welcome you. That's a
yeah,
really powerful, powerful message. So you are that role model. You may not have had the role model, but you have become that role model. Yeah.
yeah, and I hope that I can continue to be, in whatever capacity.
Fantastic. I'm really that's a really good story, right? And it's not by story. I don't mean it's made. It's a really good, you know.
Yeah.
It's really good to hear that. Um, I'm going to just explore a few more. If anyone in the audience has any questions which they'd like to ask, then just raise your hands and we'll come to you. Otherwise, I've got a few more questions. Um, what would you, I'm going to ask you, what would you like to see going forward? Because, yeah, what would you like to see going forward? Um, Either Imperial or society? What would be your kind of like number one ask
Oh,
for people of color? Um,
okay. For people of color, I thought you meant my number one
yeah.
ask in the world. And then I was going to say a 4-day work week, please. But no. So to be honest, what I'd like to see is I think we're now at the stage where people of color are starting to, but nowhere near enough, get a seat at the table. And that's organizationally, governmentally, in many spheres, but they're not getting an equitable seat at the table. And I
Mm,
think if we're going to see real change for minoritized communities, they need to have the same, not just they need to be given a voice, they have the voice now. Although in many spheres they don't, so I don't want to preclude, in certain groups I think aren't actually represented enough at all, and I'd argue that in some areas of Imperial, definitely so.
mhm,
But I think that their voices are not given the same gravitas
mhm,
as those of white people.
mhm,
Um, and I think that needs to change if we're
mhm,
going to see real societal change around the opportunities for people of color, the treatment of people of color. Um, yeah, there's obviously more things that I could say that I wanted. I mean, for example, I'd love to see more people of color in senior leadership at Imperial,
mhm,
particularly women of color.
mhm,
But I think societally, if we're going to need to change that, I think there's a lot of people out there who will say we meet quotas now.
mhm,
You know, the percentage of black people, for example, in the country mirrors the percentage of black people in SLT at this particular organization. Therefore, we've done our job. But
yeah,
actually, first of all, you can always do more.
yeah,
But even despite that, are your people of color at that level actually being given the same power, the
yeah,
same authority, the same respect
mhm,
and their counterparts?
mhm,
And in many cases, that's still not the case.
mhm,
They're not setting the agenda, they're not creating policy, they don't have the same respect in the boardroom. And I think until that changes, and I'm not just talking about organizations, I'm also talking politically, I'm talking in other spheres too, you're not going to see the level of change that I think we need in
mhm,
society. Um, yeah, and I think this goes for everything. That these things need to change within organizations such as the police, because obviously that affects so much. It needs to change in education. It needs to change in healthcare. There's so
mhm,
much racial inequality in healthcare. And I think until we have that, until they're the ones who are the influencers of change themselves at those levels, I don't think we'll see it cascade down.
yeah. I think you're right on that. I think um, you're right to say that we need to see more than performative and tokenistic gestures of putting people in place without giving them the necessary support or necessary voice to influence change, or not having allowing them to express their thoughts. Why I say that is that you put somebody in place who actually, in reality, they think exactly the same as the status quo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And there is no
and that happens a lot.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
You know. Um, so what we really do need is that true level of diversity.
yeah, yeah, and like you just said, diversity of thought
That's right.
is really important. In fact,
Yeah,
actually, that was one of my points when I attended an Imperial brand workshop, that
yeah,
I said I wanted Imperial to celebrate diversity of thought more.
yeah,
And I think that goes for everywhere.
yeah.
If you don't do that, then if you're scared of thinking differently, or you're scared of people who will think differently, and to try and embrace or engage with those ideas. Doesn't mean you have to adopt all of them. You won't move forward.
That's right.
Right?
That's
Yeah,
right. We'll stagnate.
yeah,
So I'm going to come to our final two questions then, right? Kind of like on the a similar theme, but slightly, they're more personal than this global thing, right?
sure.
And those final two questions are, what advice would you now give to your younger self, right? And the second part would be, what would your younger self look at you now and say, wow?
Okay. Let's take them one at a time.
Mhm.
Yeah, these are like the strengths and weaknesses questions in interviews. So, okay, so what would I say to my younger self? I think I'd say, well, first of all, you're going to be okay. Um, which, yeah, I don't know whether he would believe, but I would say that. But also to say that, or to be honest, actually, what I would love to say to him now is don't waste so much time thinking about what other people are thinking or worrying about perceptions. Try and live in the moment a little bit more.
Mhm.
I think growing up in that culture of high performance and high expectation and also never really kind of feeling like you fit in meant that I spent an awful lot of time with anxiety and panic around lots of things that weren't in my control,
Mhm.
lots of things that didn't even matter in the long
Mhm.
run. And I actually think for a long time I was actually, in many cases, forgetting to live
Mm.
and just enjoy myself, which I've stopped now. I
Mhm.
actually I love my life, and
Mhm.
I do take time to just enjoy being in the moment with things now, and I think that's so important, but it's so easily lost when you're in a darker time or in a period where things just aren't great. And I think that's really, yeah, that's what I would love to be able to say. But sadly, I don't know whether it would have made a difference back then because it's not the easiest thing to hear when you're
Yeah.
not in that positive sphere. Yeah, but I think those would be my kind of key points of advice for my younger self. Now, in terms of what my younger self would think of when he looked at me, um, I think first of all, he'd probably think, "Oh, you didn't become a scientist. You didn't go to Oxbridge. Oh, what happened there?" Like, because that was always the plan. I was supposed to go to Oxford and study chemistry and go and work in the city and become an investment banker. And I would have hated every aspect of that. Honestly, I'm so glad that never happened in the end. But honestly, not getting into Oxford was the best thing that ever happened to me. But yeah, I think he would. I think he would probably be quite surprised that I didn't kind of become this high flying achiever. But then I am in my own way, right?
Yeah.
You know, I've achieved a lot in my own life, just not what I would have considered achievements back when I was, 16, 17 or
Yeah.
younger. But I think he'd look at me and be surprised because um, one thing I do now that my friends have all picked up on, that my family's picked up on in the last couple of years, that I never used to do when I was a kid that much or in my 20s, I smile because I'm happy.
Yeah.
And I think I think that would probably sort of be, maybe he'd look at me and think, oh, you're smiling a lot. I don't do this right now. I frown a lot. Like,
Mm.
and yeah, I think that would probably, I'd hope that he would realize that,
Yeah.
and then that he'd have something to look forward to because
Yeah.
of it. Because yeah, if I really look back at that time period for a long period of my life, I didn't really smile that much, and now I do it without even thinking. And also, I think he'd be quite pleased that I'm nearly 35 and my hairline isn't receding yet. So, something's going right. So, although I think he was a lot less vain than I am now. So,
I like that final part.
got to be said. So,
I did say those were my final two questions, but as you were talking, there was something that came into my head, which I just want to explore if you don't mind,
yeah,
right?
of course.
And it was just the fact when you said about that smiling, that you smile a lot more. Do you feel, and I suspect I know the answer, but I'm just going to ask it anyhow. Um, do you think that one, the amount of pressure that you put on yourself because of what you thought others were expecting of you prevented you from, as you've said already, living in the moment, right? And because you actually wanted to please people, that was actually an extra burden on top. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you've summarized it really well. That's exactly how it was. Yeah, I mean, I can honestly think of so many instances in my life where I have physically stopped like enjoying myself in spaces like a party or like a work situation, an office day, um, where because of massive insecurities about what other people were thinking about me, or because I was not liking something about myself, and then I would spiral and start thinking, oh, they're all noticing this about you, or this, and I've managed to break that cycle now, and yes, it is the reason why I'm smiling more, because I think now, instead of those thoughts plaguing my head all the time, I just
Mhm.
think about the stuff I want to think about.
Yeah.
um and if anyone's worked with me on level 4 in Sheffield, they'll know that half the time I'm basically just singing along to Beyonce at my desk, dancing away. So like, I've got to be smiling when that's happening. So like,
So you didn't tell us about your Beyonce.
I mean, let's face it, I've had my own renaissance, haven't I? So
I love it. I love it. Atta, it's been absolutely wonderful having you as a guest. You've been so open and candid about your experience, and the journey that you've gone on. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you've got to that stage where you can have your renaissance and have your smile, right? Because that is that's a true sense of being able to know that I belong. And you know what? I don't need other people's to tell me that I belong.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
and
no,
that's beautiful.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's been, honestly, it's been great.
It's been
Yeah.
fantastic. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just share what we're gonna be doing next week, our next guest. And then anyone who wants to stay behind, then please feel free to. So next week, our guest is gonna be Deborah Babalola, and she is a co-founder of Dot Plot. It sounds a bit intriguing, so I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna let her tell you about this company. She was at Imperial a few years ago, and did this spin-off company, Dot Plot. Great idea. So please join us next week. Um, Also, next week, Wednesday, we're having a Meet the Author. Imperialist One presents Meet the Author with Joseph, and he's a PhD student here at Imperial. And he is going to be telling us about the book which he's written called Love and Paradox. So please come along. If you're in Sheffield, if you're at Sir Alexander Fleming Building, room 121 at 12:30 on Wednesday. Please come along. And if you have missed any of the other Belonging series episodes, then please go to tinyurl.com/belonging dash IAO, and you'll be able to see and hear many of the other interviews that we've done. Brilliant guests, all of them. Um, all I can say is it's been wonderful being back with you and to hear some more stories. And remember, all of us have that opportunity to find a place where we belong. Sometimes we just have to go searching a little bit more or let things go so that we know that we get that, or we can gain that sense of belonging. So until next week, have a good week, and I will see you again soon.